Cops. What is the saddest arrest that you've ever had to make? Story 1. I have two. One is an arrest I made and one was a story shared to me. Number 1, I had to arrest a guy that had embezzled money from a large corporation over the course of 10 months. How he did it was every week the store would have a cash deposit, so he would make it late and take money off the top of it. In order to make it whole again, he would take money from the following week's deposit to make it whole again. This went on and on until he stole up to $32,000. So when I arrived at the storefront to arrest him, the store's asset protection agent was telling me how he made up the story about his daughter being sick and how he was using the money for hospital bills and he was going to pay it back. So of course I think, wow, that's a really sad story, but maybe he was just trying to get away with it. Well, when I walk up to him, he stands up and puts his arms behind his back, so I cuff him. Sure enough, during my search, I found bills from his daughter's hospital and, to make it worse, an eviction notice from his landlord. Number 2, the perp was a woman in her 50s, managing the back room at a medium-sized chain store where they keep the cash. She has gambling habits, and one day she's a bit short, so she's the one dealing with the back room. She checks that the money is there when tellers take their post and clock out. She thinks, no big deal, I'll just take some to pay the debts and pay it back next month. No one will be the wiser. Of course, as she isn't caught that month, and because her gambling habits aren't making her any money, she keeps doing it over and over, manages to keep the cash flow to the tellers so nobody's the wiser. Then she comes up to 60 years old, age of retirement here, and there's a hole. Don't remember how much, but enough that she can't cover it by liquidating almost all of her assets at a loss, something in the multiple thousands. Auditor comes in with the accountant to make sure everything is in order. Of course, as she got cash from the bank to fill the hole, everything is in large bills, 200s and 500s. And right away the auditor catches that, as the back room has, in theory, only small bills and coins. She ended up buckling under the questions and revealing everything. Lost her retirement pension, didn't go to jail, I believe, but she got the book otherwise thrown at her, as it wasn't for anything remotely noble. That first one was a real tearjerker. Does what he has to do for his family and doesn't fight the consequences. Story 2. It wasn't an arrest, but I still get sad thinking about it. There was this local elderly gentleman, probably in his 90s, who was no longer able to drive properly. He was in several accidents, car versus sign or walls, and was one incident away from having his license taken. Well, one day we found his license plate embedded in a freshly dented car. Another officer and I went to his home to speak with him. I'll refer to the driver as Oscar. Oscar wasn't home, but we had a long conversation with his boyfriend. He told us all about his happy life with Oscar, and how Oscar was the one in charge of bringing food home since he was the only one with a license. We went back to the PD after we were done talking. Oscar was already there when we arrived. Another officer had found him and was speaking to him. We watched as the officer carefully explained to Oscar that he was in a car accident, and I don't think I can properly explain the look of confusion in Oscar's face. He had no idea he hit another car, and he looked at the bent plate like it was from another world. At the end, the officer told Oscar he needed to give up his license. His hand shook like crazy the entire time. He tried to pull his license out of his wallet over and over, but he just couldn't get it out. The officer ended up doing it for him. In the end, the three of us just stared at each other for a while. Story 3. Not a cop, I used to work at a halfway house. This one felon was particularly nice, was just glad to be out of jail and get out into the world again. He wasn't allowed any vacations or visits for 6 months, but got granted a vacation for Christmas, which he wasn't able to see in over a year. He was anticipating this, so was working his bum off to try and afford presents for his little girl as most of his paycheck was going to the state. On Christmas Eve, we were doing checks on him, making sure he was at his house, and his little girl, 6 to 7, answered the phone. We asked if Bob was around, and she said no, he was at the casino. We had to call his PO and my boss, and they told us to go get him. He called back within probably 5 minutes and said he was at the house the whole time. When we went to grab him, he said that his brother, named Rob, was the one at the casino and it was a misunderstanding. His brother Rob was there as well and showed me his receipts that it was in fact him. I tried to call my boss, but it was already too late. Bob clutched his daughter and started crying and said, "Sorry, I can't be around for Christmas Day to see all your presents, but Santa's coming. He told me so." Yeah, I cried later that night. Precaution, we were told that he wasn't where he was and the BOP doesn't like to take risks. It was reported and had to be carried out. If we said, oh, it was just a mistake and he actually was there drinking, he's going to make our agency look like scrap. Or ends up getting in a fight and ending someone, it's all going to be on us and the PO who said, let him go. The Bureau of Prisons doesn't take risks regarding felons, especially violent ones like he was. They'll just ask, who made the call to let him be? No one wants to be that guy, especially with the feds. We've had to go bring people back for a lot less, or we have to run out and do a spot check if they don't answer the phone or something seems fishy. Story 4. I work in long-term care, and in this instance, I was a marketing rep for a memory care community in California. A woman came in wanting to discuss placement for her husband. Mr. and Mrs. A lived in Hawaii. Mrs. wanted to take a trip to California to visit her daughter and found a retirement community in Hawaii where her husband could stay for a few weeks with some supervision, meals, and activities. Mr. drove her to the airport and she gave him strict instructions to drive the car back to the community and leave it there. She even had him call her to make sure he got there okay. Tip: if your loved one needs to check in after driving somewhere, they should not be driving. A few days later, she found out from the police that Mr. took the car out and en route to wherever he was heading, hit and ended a pedestrian. He was incarcerated in a prison setting. Mrs. returned to Hawaii and spent months trying to get him released. Eventually, Mr. was released from the prison because he was too far into dementia to be appropriate there. He was transferred to a mental institution, where he spent his days among the truly insane. This also was not an appropriate place for someone with advanced dementia. This time, Mrs. has hired an attorney to see if they can appeal to the court system to get him out of the mental institution. Mr. had no idea why he was there and doesn't remember the accident at all. Mrs. traveled back to California and walked into my community. As a former fiduciary, I understood what the judge was going to want to sign orders for him to be released to our care. We crafted a pleading that included a guarantee that Mr. would never be allowed outside the locked dementia unit for any reason, including outings, social activities, or visits to family. It was the best we could do for a person who should have been in prison but lacked the capacity to understand the sentence. The judge accepted our pleading and released him to the care of my community. He has no idea why he's there. Mrs. carries the guilt of allowing her husband to drive, knowing he was not appropriate but still not wanting to restrict his independence. The story is sad and should serve a huge eye-opener to anyone that thinks their loved one with dementia is able to drive or that removing their access to a car is somehow limiting their independence. Story 5. Friend's dad is a retired detective. Not sure why he did, but one evening when my friends and I went over for a barbecue, he joined us and was a bit buzzed and told us a story of how he and his partner responded to a home invasion crime scene in a more affluent middle-class suburb. Father and 2 young kids were all slain. The house wasn't even ransacked and the only thing stolen was a big screen TV and a video game console. They eventually caught the 2 perps as they were still fleeing in the streets carrying the big screen TV in public. Both were 19 to 20 years old. They eventually confessed that they just wanted the TV and video game console when they would often see the kids playing it through the big open living room window when they walked by the neighborhood, and decided to end them to not leave witnesses. The worst thing he told us was, less than an hour after the crime scene was taped off, the wife came home in a taxi after being away for a week in a business trip to find crime scene tape, police cars and coroner vehicles surrounding her house. Another worst part was that was supposedly his last month on the job before retiring. That is heart-wrenching. Coming home to see her whole family gone. I don't even know what I would do if I was in her position. But I know what you should do. Hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel. Story 6. Not the one doing the arresting, just a witness to the slow-motion disaster. At the VA hospital, a vet drove himself in with crushing chest pain. Of course, he didn't call 911. Never one to ask for help. Once he got to the ER, it was clear based on his EKG he was having a massive heart attack. So he gets whisked away by the cardiologists to have some stents put in his coronaries. At some point during the commotion, he realizes his legally owned, fully licensed concealed weapon is in his jacket. Needless to say, as he was passing away from his heart attack, it wasn't at the top of his to-do list to empty his pockets before leaving the house. He alerted the nurse immediately and asked her to have an officer come and secure it. A few hours after he made it back to his room to recover, one of the junior officers showed up with a summons and a ticket for $2,500. He apologized to the old guy and said he hadn't wanted to do it. The supervisor made him, but didn't have the guts to do it himself. The patient was in tears. He'd been saving what little he could to help his daughter move closer so he could help take care of the new grandbaby. Patients immediately post-heart attack generally don't benefit from this kind of added stress. Story 7. Had to arrest a guy because his ex-wife reported him for DV falsely over divorce or money disagreement. So she rolled up in a new car to point to the location to us, and this guy was already paying half of his salary in child support and living in a dump. So eventually they started arguing and she was, "I don't care if it is not true. I'm gonna drag you to court until you pay for everything." And the worst part was, he had a dog that he had to leave in the apartment, and he didn't have anybody to call. Ended up driving to his relative after the shift to give them the apartment keys. On a lighter note, I have a friend who works in a family law firm, not a lawyer. They often advise their clients who are going through a divorce to never be alone with their spouse. It is distressingly common for false DV charges to be brought against the other spouse. Yes, it's very common with their male clients, but they have had female clients whose husbands were trying to trump up DV charges against them too. DV is a he said, she said more often than not, and it's such a crap show. Story 8. Not a police officer, but involved in the CPS system. Police were called to an apartment by a relative of the occupant. She could hear the 2 young children inside but could not reach their mother, and the kids wouldn't open the door. Neighbors had reported the children were often left to play alone in the playground, sometimes for hours at a time. The police opened the door to find a 2-year-old and 9-month-old home alone. The state of their diapers indicated that they had been unchanged in over 24 hours. There was no visible food that the 2-year-old had access to, and clearly nothing for the 9-month-old. There were cleaning chemicals that had been spilled in the bathroom. The children were put into protective care. The mother returned to the apartment 36 hours after the police intervened and was arrested. Mother refused to meet with her court-ordered attorney, refused all services, counseling, rent assistance, etc., and did not attend any hearings. After 18 months in the care of a responsible family member, the mother's rights were terminated. As someone who isn't a social worker, the story of these kids kind of messed me up for a little bit. I can only imagine what social workers have seen. I wonder how many times that had happened before someone called the cops. I can't even imagine what those poor little guys had to go through. Story 9. Here is a few. A homeless guy comes in and asks if he can sleep in one of the jail beds for the night. As that was against policy, Dad tells him that he can't do that and the only way you go into that cell is if you're arrested for something. The homeless guy walks over to the payphone and rips it off the wall. I arrest him and he gets to spend the night in the cell. It was Christmas and I was driving down the street when I saw a car blow a red light pretty bad. Stop the car and it's a single mom with 2 kids, about 6 and 8. It's obvious they don't have a lot of money. Mom has a felony no bail warrant. So I took Mom and booked her into jail and her kids got to go with CPS on Christmas morning. And Christmas hasn't gone by in 18 years there. I don't think about that car stop and how that family, both mom and kids, is today. I was called at a movie rental shop. Some guy walks in and goes around to each section acting casual. They saw him pocket a movie and told the owner. The owner tackles the guy as he's running out the door. If anyone doesn't understand the MPAA, a rental copy is licensed differently and costs $300, or at least it did back then, which made this guy's theft a felony. If he had stolen the for-sale copy, it would have been a lower crime since it's only valued at $20. It was this idiot's third felony which made it 20 to 25 years. I used to work at a juvenile detention facility. Basically, my place is like the county jail for 18 and under, sometimes up to 21. It's a shame when kids come in and have been roughed up by their parents or others. Even worse when they come in with no shoes or no shirt. Really sad when it's both, which is more frequent than I care to say. I'm sure it's pretty sad when a police officer has to go arrest a kid who has surely been roughed up and neglected. Like, the kid has no chance, was never taught anything right. Makes me really sad and really pissed. My partner and I were called to a 7-Eleven for a shoplifter. The guy turned out to be homeless and was just lifting some Twinkies because he was hungry. We decided to just remove him from the store rather than actually arrest him and get him something to eat. Well, the guy panicked and tried to book it, breaking my partner's thumb in the brush. Then we had to take him in for harming an officer. Turned out he had a number of strikes already and ended up with a 10 to 15-year sentence, all over some Twinkies because he was hungry. Story 10. Was embedded with cops as a public radio producer 3 years ago, so I got to see a bunch of pretty sad arrests. The highlights. Guy got dumped by his girlfriend, so he called the cops and claimed she had really bad thoughts about ending herself. They showed up and she had the choice of either being carted off to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation or being taken into protective custody. Woman cornered and roughed up another woman in a 7-Eleven parking lot over the attention of a used car mechanic who hit on one of them while waiting in line at a dollar store. Older guy, 50s, 60s, was arrested after showing up at an apartment and using one of his crutches to smash in a window to gain entry. Turns out he had been released from the local jail that afternoon, tried to go back to his last apartment only to find out other people were living there, and then smash the window out. His release papers were in his back pocket when he was searched. I know cops get a lot of crap, and rightfully so in some cases, but man, they have to deal with a metric crap ton of bummers. Story 11. I once got arrested driving home from work after a 15-hour shift. My license was suspended. I tried to explain that I just got off work and was driving home after a long, hard shift. The cop told me he wouldn't have arrested me, but his brass showed up, and he had to. It seemed like he genuinely felt bad about it, and even put the cuffs on me extra loose. Or as loose as he could, anyway. My license was suspended because of the unpaid e-pass. Florida tolls. Fines. So to clear things up, he arrested me because I was driving with a suspended license. He pulled me over in the first place because he got behind me, ran my tags, as they love to do to random cars in Florida, and the car being registered to me came back showing that my DL was suspended. Story 12. Here are things that I have heard and witnessed. I once saw a cop confiscated a kid's bike because it was parked on the sidewalk, I guess. The kid looked like 12 and was dressed like a lost member of the Jesus and Mary chain or Bauhaus, and he didn't even fight, just sat, defeated while the cop put the bike in the trunk of his car and left. After a search warrant, a man was arrested for illegal substances and weapons and taken away. Only other person in the house was a 1-year-old baby. As a new father at the time, I held the baby until CPS came. Shivering, he held on to me for dear life. He was wearing only a dirty diaper with no other diapers in the house. No food in the fridge. I cleaned him up and wrapped him in a towel. No blankets in the house. I almost started crying. My uncle is a cop. He arrested a young girl for ending her bully. The bully was a young girl too, who insulted and roughed up this girl every day but used to be friends with her. She charged her with a blunt object and hit her. Needless to say, since life isn't a movie, she was found a week later by cops who heard the bully chase the other girl home from school. And why the court decided not to go easy on her was it wasn't just self-defense. My parents used to rent a house to a weird couple. They had something like 4 kids in a relatively small house. It was that kind of couple that when they had lice, they shaved everyone bald. Actually happened. Child Protective Services came to their door, and since the house was pretty much next to ours, I heard or saw how that went. It's a couple of people from Child Protective Services and about 2 to 3 cops who take away the children, mother screaming. I can't imagine how crappy the job must be. Horror to see, but to be a cop at that moment, that's harsh. These stories are crazy. You win. I'm tearing up, man. That's some heavy stuff. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy police officers. What are your best pull-over stories? Story 3 was hella funny. See you in that video.